In line with the theme for today, expanding the limits of academic medicine, I want to look at the intersection of medicine and humanistic education. While there is abundant scholarship on medical humanism in the 16th and 17th centuries, very little attention has been paid to the medical interests and in some cases medical training of the humanists of the 15th century. In this short paper, I want to redress this for one humanist who was also a physician, namely Pier Paolo Vergerio, who holds particular renown in the field of Renaissance studies, the studies of Renaissance humanism, since he was the first author of a humanistic educational treatise, namely De Ingenuis Moribus et Liberalibus Studiis, which means something like on good character and liberal education, but the precise meaning is tricky, so I'll refer to the Latin title instead. This text was written around 1402 or 1403 and dedicated to Ubertino da Carrara, who was the son of the Lord of Padua, Francesco Novello. My aims here today are to demonstrate the influence of Galenism on this work, and so to locate it in a very different classical tradition from the rebirth of Cicero and Quintilian that it's usually identified with. Secondly, I'll argue that this Galenic tradition explains particular features of his work, without which we might assume these features to be typical for humanism or indeed humanistic innovations. And finally, I'll consider how this changes our understanding of the purpose and social-political setting of this supposedly humanist education. Vergerio's, but of course we can think about other humanists who followed in his footsteps. I'll begin by giving you some key facts about this text. It's not only the first independent humanist educational treatise, but it's also the most successful. It's extant in over 300 manuscripts, as well as 40 printed editions. So in popularity, it's surpassed only by Leonardo Bruni's version of St. Basil's treatise Ad Adolescentes, which was composed around 1400 and is extant in at least 435 manuscripts. But this, of course, is a translation rather than an original humanist composition. In fact, Bruni's work on Basil may well have inspired Vergerio's educational interest, since the two humanists became friends when Vergerio studied in Florence. And after his departure from the city, Bruni, of course, famously dedicated his dialogues Ad Petrum Paulum Histrum to Pier Paolo Vergerio around 1407. And as Carol Quillen has shown, that work by Bruni contains echoes of Vergerio's work. I'm mentioning this to show how, on the one hand, Vergerio had enormous reach as trendsetter of a humanistic approach to education, and on the other hand, that he was closely connected with that Florentine circle of humanists, often called the civic humanists. And this is important for that larger question, namely what was humanist about Vergerio's pedagogy, either in curriculum or in its wider ideals, and also whether there's anything specifically civic in the sense of being suited to or in advocacy of self-government by the middling classes, as is often said to be the case for civic humanism in Florence. Now, to start with the first matter, there's not a whole lot of scholarship on Vergerio's text, but every discussion notes its humanistic emphasis on rhetoric, moral philosophy, and history, as one would expect given Vergerio's reliance on Cicero and Quintilian, whose intended outcome of the education was, of course, the perfect orator. Now, I'm not at all denying the importance of Cicero and Quintilian and the oratorical curriculum, but I want to add a point, namely that this is as much or more an Aristotelian treatise. And specifically, I'll argue, this is Aristotelianism filtered through a medical lens. And indeed, the departure that Vergerio makes from the Ciceronian Quintilian ideal of the perfect orator is apparent already in the text structure. And I think this is most easily visualized, so I'll share my screen with you. So here we go. Let me see. Right, so here you see the contents of Rogerio's treatise, and as you can see, the body of the text is divided in 4 parts. The first part devoted to the characteristics of a talented adolescent, and the remaining 3 parts discussing the suitable subjects that this youngster should study. Arms and letters, but also physical exercise and so on. And indeed, this division, as you see, mirrors the division in 2 parts of the title, the mores and the studia. And this means that Vergerio's program goes much beyond the liberal arts, which are discussed only under letters in section 2, to include the training of the body, etc. And this already is a distinction from the educational scope of Quintilian and Cicero. Moving from structure to content, Vergerio doesn't just discuss the body, but frequently parallels body and mind. Now, I don't want to spend time reading out quotations, so I've just put them on the slide for reference. What I want to note is that the parallel between the body and the mind is not just a convenience, rhetorical ploy, but in fact, Vergerio uses the bodily functions as model for the functions of the mind, saying, for instance, that you should treat your memory in the same way you treat your stomach. That's to say, you shouldn't overload it, and you should choose the input selectively so the memory can cook it down. Decoquere is the verb he uses. But Vergerio goes even further than these parallel functions. He is quite explicit that the mind is in fact dependent on the constitution of the body. As he puts it, the soul follows the composition of the body. And here, of course, we see Vergerio's Galenic outlook on body and mind, or body and soul, in a nutshell. You really couldn't summarize it more succinctly. It almost reads as a phrase like Galen's treatise, the title of Galen's treatise, which is now known under the Latin title Quod animi mores corporis temperamenta sequantur, but which in the 14th century was translated with complexio instead of temperamenta, and also anima instead of animus, just as Vergerio does in his treatise. However, before we get carried away with this sort of textual close reading, it is also a fact that Vergerio never makes explicit reference to Galen, nor to any other medical author or text. Instead, as his authority for the relationship between the body and the soul, he twice invokes by name Aristotle, first from De Anima and later from the pseudo-Aristotelian Problemata. So this raises the question, does De Ingenuis Moribus reflect a specific medical knowledge, or rather a general Aristotelianism? And there are a couple of things to consider here. Vergerio very rarely cites his authorities by name. The same is true for Cicero and Quintilian, and of course that doesn't mean he didn't use them. Also, current editions of the text do not reference any implicit medical citations or paraphrases either, despite the assertion of the most recent editor, Craig Callendorf, that he offers an identification of Rogerio's major classical sources. But of course, this may well reflect the interest of the editors. I mean, who's to decide what is a major classical source, as well as the fact that it's not so easy to identify unlabeled borrowings from the enormous output of Galen, especially when we don't know in what form, or even indeed in what language, these texts would have reached Rogerio, although I will say a few words about that later. So instead, my approach has been to see how Rogerio reads his Aristotle, because in his also unacknowledged borrowings from Aristotle, we see Rogerio firming up this relationship between the body and the soul beyond what Aristotle actually wrote. And he does so by supplying the cause for this connection, which he finds in the humors. In other words, he is reading Aristotle through a Galenic medical lens. I'll give two examples, one from the Rhetorica and one from the Politica. Starting with Aristotle's Rhetoric, that is in fact the source for Vergerio's exposition on the manners of youth. And this is because Aristotle, of course, presents in the Rhetoric what is perhaps the most extensive treatment of human psychology in ancient philosophy, because his purpose is to investigate the mindset of the audience to which the orator must make his speech appeal. And in this context, the young are characterized by Aristotle by their changeability, their impulsiveness, their keen spirits, courage, generosity, trustingness. And the reason for this lies primarily in their minds. The young have high hopes, he says, because they are as yet untempered by experience or memory, or to be more precise, by experience collected in the memory. The old age is the reverse. It is mistrustful, cowardly, endlessly deliberating, and for the opposite reason, the elderly have been humbled by life and have learned from experience. They live with the memory of the past rather than with hope for the future. Aristotle also characterizes both ages by temperature. But sorry, I'm losing my cursor here. Yeah, characterizes both ages by temperature. For he says, old men are the opposite of the young. They are chilled, whereas the young are hot. But the text here is indecisive about which way the body-mind relationship is working. The reasoning of Aristotle suggests, because it's about expectation versus experience, suggests that it's the mentality that affects both bodies and emotions. And as such, the young are full of hope, like those who are drunk with wine, they are warmed through. Conversely, old age paves the way for cowardice, and indeed fear is a kind of chill. Now, if we go back to the text of Vergerio, you'll see that Vergerio follows these passages very closely. He too notes that the young are generous, full of hope, trusting, passionate, and the opposite of old age. Also, like Aristotle, he attributes these characteristics in part to their lack of experience. But he then adds a second explanation, namely that they are following their nature, which he understands purely physically. It is due to their overabundant heat and blood. Blood, of course, wasn't there in Aristotle. And furthermore, this heat and blood, Vergerio links to a bodily process that is unique to the young, namely growth. Indeed, he says growth causes the movements of the humors, which lies at the heart of the volatility of the youth, just as their natural heat explains their high spirits. So, whereas for Aristotle, these qualities are derived from experience and memory, or lack thereof, in the mind of the old and the young, Vergerio presents a bodily Galenic view of age at the root of these symptoms. And I should note here also that this is not a consequence of the Latin versions, Latin translations of Aristotle that Vergerio may have used. Most English translations, incidentally, are inflected by a humoralism that is still very much embedded in our language. For instance, the Greek thumikoi is translated as hot-blooded or hot-tempered, when probably a translation like spirited or sharp-spirited would be more appropriate. But the medieval Latin translations give irascibiles et iracundi, so focusing on ire, or in the case of William of Moerbeke, animosi et acuti irae. So, in other words, Vergerio's humoral reading is his own addition. It doesn't depend on his version of Aristotle. A similar reading is possible for sections of the Politics. So looking at the treatment of age in the Politics, Aristotle discusses what ages are appropriate for physical and intellectual education. And he says that in puberty or before puberty, gymnastic training should be light so as not to stunt the body. And these years instead should be used for school learning. Vergerio repeats this advice, but he adds that in addition to age, account should be taken of the individual body types, the individual body or individual body types, the dispositio or habitudo corporis. Specifically, he says, those with a soft or moist temperament should dry out and toughen up through vigorous exercises, sicandi indurandique, he says, while others should go more gently. And similarly, those with easily inflamed blood should avoid training in the hot sun. So clearly, Vergerio understands Aristotle's injunctions, which are effectively not to overburden a youngster through a humoral matrix. Let us move then to the sources of Vergerio's knowledge. Vergerio studied Greek with Manuel Chrysoloras in Florence between 1398 and 1400. And as we know from his letter collection, his Epistolario, he took great pride in his Greek studies, and he mentions reading Plutarch, Thucydides, Plato, and Homer. But he never makes a reference to Galen as a Greek author that he had read or that he wanted to read in the original. In other words, his interest in Galen is not part of his humanist project. What we're seeing instead is rather the influence of Galenus Latinus, as Vergerio encountered him while studying for his doctor's degree in medicine in Padua, which he obtained in 1394. So before he began studying Greek. Now, the precise curriculum of the Padua degree course is not known, but it will have been comparable to the courses taught in Bologna in 1405, which are the earliest statutes with information on the medical curriculum in existence. And at Bologna, the curriculum for medical theory was fairly evenly split between Avicenna's canon and treatises by Galen. These were primarily the treatises pertaining to diagnosis and the treatment of diseases, rather than the more philosophical one. But the list includes the book De Temperamentis, again under the title De Complexionibus, which is precisely devoted to this correlation between physical and mental mixtures. However, the fairly generic nature of Vergerio's statements in the Ingenuis Moribus may make it impossible to match Vergerio's text to specific Galenic passages. So instead, I've put Vergerio side by side with the medical text that he would indubitably have been exposed to at Padua, namely Avicenna's canon, in the mid-13th century translation of Gherardo da Cremona. What you can see here, I've again focused on a passage about the temperament of childhood. with the English translation of the Arabic text underneath. And what you can see is that the Latin translation by Gerardo does apparently a pretty good job. And you can also see that Vergerio on the right side is very, very close to these ideas and even to the phrasing. He likewise connects children's liquidity to growth, as we've already seen. He also sees this as being caused by the closeness to conception and notes that this makes their constitution, their nerves in particular, weak. Now, I want to underline, I'm not making a claim for any direct borrowings from this particular passage, but I think it's clear that this is the discourse and idiom that shaped Vergerio's understanding of childhood as a physiological condition. So moving on then to that question of how Vergerio's Galenic thinking explains particular features of his work. In other words, how his medical knowledge shapes his approach to education. I will indicate three areas very briefly. The treatise places a strong emphasis on individuality, personal strengths and weaknesses of each youngster to which the education must be tailored. Vergerio asserts that different minds may suit different disciplines and even specific routines of study. And the reason, of course, is the constant insistence in Galenic medicine on the individual temperament or types of temperament which determine what sort of treatments are appropriate for diseases. And this makes Vergerio's approach quite different from Cicero's and Quintilian, with their curricula geared towards the single ideal of the perfect orator. On the other hand, we see the same concern with individuality in, for instance, the educational treatises of Erasmus. So it's worth considering whether Erasmus gets this, for instance, from Vergerio. Another typical Erasmian tenet in De Ingenuis Moribus is the emphasis on the joys of learning. The contemporary medical consensus had it that what brings pleasure is healthy, because the condition of the mind is humorally linked to that of the body. What's pleasant for one is good for the other. In advice books of the 14th century, health regimens and otherwise, this generates recommendations on how to arouse pleasure for the sake of health. Thus, in Piero de Crescenzi's work on architecture, there's one book devoted to, I quote, how plants and trees give pleasure to the rational soul and consequently preserve the health of the body, since the humoric state of the body is always closely related to the disposition of the soul, unquote. Likewise, the physician Gentile da Foligno in the early 14th century wrote, quote, among other things, the patient should take care not to remain alone or plunge himself in sadness or heavy thoughts. To this end, conversation with good friends works well, as do a change in scenery, tackling things that seem challenging to complete, and walking and hunting. And Vergerio's younger contemporary, the physician Ugo Benzi, extended this list of pleasurable, beneficial occupations with, I quote, reading something not too difficult, unquote. Now, Vergerio is constantly emphasizing the joyfulness of the various disciplines. Arithmetics he calls jucundissima, astronomy pulcherrima and its practice jucundum, medicine is pulcherrima as well as commodissima. To sum it up, I quote, everything is pleasant to understand, unquote. So effectively, Vergerio is extending the pleasures of the countryside and the hunt and the chase, talk with friends and light reading, to the contemporary liberal arts and university disciplines. And these subjects, therefore, become not just intellectual pursuits, but rather elements of a healthy lifestyle. And in that sense, Vergerio's book itself has a medical application. It doesn't just set out a school curriculum. Instead, it offers instruction regarding everything that's needed for a well-rounded, balanced life. And as such, the Ingenuis Moribus, although it's geared towards adolescence, in truth is applicable to all age groups, for what the young must learn, the old should practice. And this was indeed understood by the Florentine Chancellor Coluccio Salutati, who wrote to Vergerio after he had received a copy of the text, I quote, "To me, you seem not to educate a youngster, but to polish a perfect man for all walks of life and differences of human age." And this brings me to the final point, the social and political setting of Vergerio's text. For what we've seen so far, embeds Vergerio's treatise in the world of lifestyle advice for those wealthy enough to have a lifestyle around 1400. In other words, the world of the aristocracy. As we have seen, liberal studies, including letters, are treated as a form of refined self-care on a par with aristocratic leisurely activities like the hunt. Obviously, this is very different from the civic argument for liberal education, namely that it trains and prepares young men to serve the state. So this is an argument then for taking this trailblazer of humanist education out of the world of civic humanism, rather placing it into the world of the noble court, and specifically the Paduan court of Francesco Novello, but that's an argument for another day. Let me instead, to round off, return very quickly to the title that I rather glossed over at the beginning. What exactly are the Ingenii Mores and the Liberalia Studia for Vergerio? The trouble, of course, is that ingenuus translates as innate, but also as free-born or as noble. Mores could be manners, morals, character. Studium could be studies, but also zeal or pursuit. And what liberal means is anybody's guess. And this ambiguity is reflected in the titles that the treatise is now commonly known by in English. What I have shown today, I hope, is that the ingenui mores have to be the qualities bestowed by nature. This is a consequence of Vergerio's medical perspective that links the mental temperaments to those of the body. At the same time, because Vergerio's setting is so clearly aristocratic, he probably wouldn't want to rule out the possibility that nature grants these qualities, particularly to the nobility. That is what we mean by good breeding, after all. So I would say that the ambivalence is deliberate, and I would suggest a translation of Ingenui Mores with something like well-born disposition. The Liberalia Studia, on the other hand, are, as noted, not the liberal arts, and they are not even restricted to what we would term studies. In fact, rather, they constitute an elite lifestyle. So my proposition for the title would be the well-born dispositions and proper pursuits of youth. Thank you.